movement, provided to, there could not be, a larger, pan-India movement, because otherwise, like there would be question of region, identity, caste, and all. Like if one person, would have been doing that, it would have resulted, So democracy was, the only thing in which, everybody could be combined. This is what, Phillips' argument is made in 1950, and so, but it has, thing. And there's another one, by Subramaniam,
Maybe we should get this.
Oh, okay, yeah, right.
Let's let
Yeah,
Isabella.
okay, so this is, and about, Bikaner and Ganga Singh, like we get, information about Ganga Singh going with, his camel regiment to China, and also a hospital.
Without the camels.
Without,
Camels are not
yeah, it was noted that, he went, and then there was a hospital ship, which, went there. Then also Amar Singh, he wrote about, this thing in China. And India, impact of Japan on India was, great. In fact, like Ruins of Empire, I think knows very well, that how.
That's a whole nother big question,
Yeah.
which we should discuss. But,
Yeah.
but we must let Isabella discuss sub-imperialism, at least, if not other questions.
Yeah, well, I'll briefly address some of the other questions and then talk about sub-imperialism. So the continuity of the term Assam is because the Sikh community was, and the Sikh police were so such an apparent presence to the Chinese that they were the sort of, that's what I mean by saying they're the face of British imperialism. They were the people that were interacted with more than the British, representing this kind of unwelcome imperial power. So I think that's why, and they were very ubiquitous. So I think that's why it's become such a kind of, why it's had such momentum as a term, and absolutely is used as sort of derogatory term. The why Sikhs rather than Gurkhas or white people from the Punjab, because there were later Muslims brought over to police from the Punjab as well. It just seems that Gurkhas were valued solely within an army context, and people from Punjab, Sikhs or Muslims, were used in the army and for policing, and that's the case sort of in all sorts of different colonial settings. So that's as far as I can say, and there's a huge literature on martial races, and it was written about by sort of British officers in the army. They saw themselves as experts and came out with these really ridiculous hierarchies and accounts and very insulting sort of comparisons to animals, and it's sort of saying that Sikhs were particularly good because they were solid in an emergency and this sort of thing, but it clearly very, very, very racist. Which brings me on to this idea of sub-imperialism, which is interesting to me that this has clearly touched a nerve. A couple of comments. It's in my first draft of this article, I didn't make any mention to it. It wasn't really on my radar, and then when I got the peer review comments back, both, because this was soon after both Tony Valentine and Robert Blythe had published their books, and the idea of sub-imperialism is Robert Blythe's term, it's not mine. And he, I don't think, would certainly want to be an apologist for empire. I don't think anyone would dispute how awful imperialism was and how much both India and all the other victims of imperialism suffered. So I'm very sorry if I offended anyone with this term. It certainly wasn't my intention. I think the idea is, and I'm more persuaded and prefer Tony Valentine's idea of webs of empire, is to show that power didn't emanate from London in this kind of linear fashion, that there were different pockets of power within a kind of complex imperial setting. So that's this idea of a web that emanated also from India, and so it's still British power, but it's kind of reaching China via India, and so that's why it's so interesting that Sikhs should be representing British power. So that was really the message I was trying to convey, and I think because we had the kind of unscheduled break, I had not as much time as I would have liked to expand that. So I hope that's helped explain it, and perhaps we can discuss it a little more.
You had a comment.
Well, question regarding some suspicion is that perhaps the Chinese look at the presence of these Indians and other Indians in these various as manifestations of imperialism, albeit it may be on behalf of the British, but it is nevertheless a negative perception. My personal view, and this room is full of China scholars, I have no connection with China at all, is that in India, in the Indian narrative, contemporary narrative, we talk of Dr. Kotnis and this, that and the other as being the great exemplars of a great relationship, 2,000-year-old peaceful relationship between India and China, when there was no border, so the question of non-peaceful did not arise. But my suspicion is that this kind of thing dominates much more the thinking of the average Chinese towards India than Dr. Kotnis. Would you care to make a comment? Or for that matter, our colleagues from China, which would be particularly welcome.
Thank you. It brings us on to a new topic, perhaps, which we don't have time to discuss now, but this, there is, and in my article I talk about this sort of hugely negative view within China of Indians as representatives of this kind of imperial presence. And I think in a way it's not at all surprising. And there was, the Sikhs had a reputation for being very violent, and there is this whole literature, Frantz Fanon and the idea that imperialism begets violence, and the Sikhs were there in a exploited position as police, but they were given a position of authority, and so they certainly had a reputation for being violent. So were the British police. So I'm sure it's very exaggerated, but there's always, whenever you see kind of Chinese histories which talk about Sikh police, it's always accompanied with descriptions of violence. And there's lots of cartoons of Sikh police kind of lashing out with their singling batons against, particularly the kind of poorest members of Chinese society, the wheelbarrow and rickshaw pullers and all the rest of it. So, so there is this very strongly racist tone to the way in which Chinese view these Indians who were present in China on behalf of the British. But clearly there were, and Professor Tumpy again has written about all the other Indians who were present in China in other roles, who had come independently as merchants, Parsi community and so on. So what would be interesting to me, and this is not something I've researched, would be whether there was a difference with Chinese views of merchants like that, or if they were still seen as kind of imperial lackeys. And how much differentiation there was between different Indian groups. But that's beyond my knowledge.
Did you have to come? We should stop for lunch pretty soon. We give her the lunch.
Thank you. I know I'm eating into lunchtime, but it's just 2 comments, so maybe. I found both of these, really interesting, and I can see the linkage also, though it may look like 2 different things, because one thought that came to my head is that, the contradiction between the roles of people, like the roles of these Sikh policemen or the soldiers, Indian soldiers, and the inner life of these people. Now, this inner life of these people is something we rarely get to hear about, because mostly, very few are literate, but unless one, and the value of Gadadhar Singh and Mahendra Garg's accounts is precisely that they give us almost the only clue to the kind of contradictions that were there. And if you extend that to the Sikhs and the policemen, then only can you explain, what surprised me also in my dissertation work, the complete sort of change in their thinking, in the 20s and 30s. They were the ones who were shooting the Chinese down, but when, it came, they just turned around. And, we have that instance in Hankou in 1925, where they just turned around and, went to the other side, the Chinese side. And this happened many times, starting from Taiping, the Taiping rebellion period. So, unless we understand that there's a role and there's an inner life, we can't really explain how these Indians function. And the second last point is that the importance that this kind of what you call natural affinity, what you mentioned, or this feeling of sympathy, locating it at the subaltern level. I mean, I was brought up on a narrative of India-China relations in the modern era, where mainly the only kind of sympathy we talked about was Tagore, and then Chiang Kai-shek and Nehru, which, as you pointed out, may not have been that sympathetic as we've made out to be, and that was the sympathy, and but if you really look at it, it needs to be explored, and the problem is the records or the lack of record. There is this sympathy at a very, I mean, they also had friction, but it's friction and sympathy combined, and it is also located at the subaltern. That's what I mean.
Thank you. Yes, please.
No, on this social and political, India, society governed and having social thought, and China politically governed and having political thought. I think this is one version of Orientalism which has to be questioned. Both countries have had complexity and multiplicity of social and political experiences. And I mean, a lot of literature, you are aware, of China also says how the value system actually governed rather than the centralized authoritarian system. Because this social versus political has been used to explain that every Chinese develops an authoritarian personality, a political personality of obedience, authority, conformity, and so on. And every Indian experiences such a variety of diverse experiences that it is less conformist. Now, conformity is there in both, whether it is a value system, a regional culture, I mean, in India it is again, the caste structure in India is full of contradictions. And therefore this political versus social, I mean, this is one version of the Weberian thing which Eisenstadt developed to contrast the two traditions of China and India. Why democracy in India and why authoritarianism in China. I think there is much more complex problem here in both the countries than this simple contradiction between social versus political brings out. That's a comment.
Some big questions.
Yeah.
I think it's time for lunch, because we need to start at what, 2:30?
Yeah.
So thank you, everybody. It was very good.